All right, it's 10:53. Let's get started on the hour to give people a few more minutes to come in. So we have 5 or 6 minutes to chill out.
That sounds good.
Done. There. So, saving the video dialogue doesn't make sense.
Okay.
I'll be in the room. So. Oh, whatever. I mean, yeah, I'll be able to pick up. Assuming I have cell service, I'll be able to pick up some. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm gonna go visit Hero. Yeah, he's in hospice right now. Meeting her, so I'm gonna visit her before I leave town. So always. Lisa tells me to do the same thing. I'm not sure what I would do otherwise.
Picture.
Yeah, she insisted on me changing my picture. The other picture was 10 years old, 11 years. So he thought it was time.
Such a cute.
Hi, Judy.
Hello. Hello. Beautiful. To the people. You want home. That's great. Makes me muscle. Those are. What? I've only had like 2 cups. Enjoy over there.
We need to make more.
That seems good. Is anyone here for coffee? It's all mine. Do you want some?
Oh, no.
It's in the kitchen. No. Yeah. Just, it was on the counter, and so I set it back. Oh. But it didn't, no. This is coming.
Not real nice. No.
The bricks were hit.
Yeah. Like somebody's heard.
When you drive by, So where's the popcorn? We didn't take. Yes. Yes, there is some popcorn from Thursday. There is popcorn from Thursday. The movie was so good. It was Enola Harris, Enola Holmes, the teenage sister of Sherlock. I mean, I wasn't down there, but I seen it 3 weeks earlier. Yeah, it's some kind of a. It's on Netflix. And there's a second that's come out since then. That's in my yes, Bonnie and me. Okay. Have you ever? It started.
And then we Jill. Lauren.
Yes. Okay. We haven't looked at it. We've had it for.
If you sure.
So it does push back. You did.
That's good.
Can you get here last night and sit up and rock happy? Yes, we're good, we're good.
All right, everybody. It's 11 o'clock. My time. It's 1 o'clock your time. Are you ready to do this?
Yes, yeah.
Cool. All right. If anybody wants to talk to me with all of your talking, it's kind of garbled. So if you want to talk to me, make sure you're talking directly to the computer, wherever that is in the room. I think it's different from the monitor.
The microphone is right up there by the camera.
There we go.
And one up here too.
Okay.
Speak towards the microphone is the important part. And other than that, if you're joining online, I invite you to mute yourself so that we don't pick up any outside noise. And otherwise, let's get going. I'm going to ask a few questions as we go along, see if I can get you entertained and involved in all the good stuff. Yeah, let's see how this goes. So my name is Adam Fletcher Sassy, and for the last several years, I've been researching and writing about the history of North Omaha. North Omaha is my passion spot in the world. I live out here next to Portland, Oregon. I have a gigantic forest out my back window and Mount Hood up the hill. So it's phenomenally beautiful, but all of my interest, all of my desire in the world is actually right there in your neighborhood. I grew up in North Omaha. I grew up at 27th and Ellis, and I went to Pearl Church and graduated from North in 1993. Since then, I have had the opportunity to travel around the world and do all the things. I'm a nonprofit and government consultant focused on engaging people. That has also been my longtime passion and interest. And I brought that to this work because when I was growing up, nobody talked about the history of North Omaha in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't a thing. I mean, sure, my fourth grade teacher, Mr. Koenig at Miller Park School, brought us all over to Fort Omaha for the River City Roundup. And that was about the extent of the history lesson. You know, it didn't go much further. But when I was growing up at Pearl, the old folks would point over to the intersection at 24th and Fort and say, that's where the streetcars went. And one of my employers at United Ministries of Northeast Omaha, his name was Ernest Neds. Ernest, when he was driving me to different jobs that we were doing, we were teaching theater in North Omaha's projects and the good old public housing projects. Ernest would point to places and say, that's where everybody played basketball for the last 40 years. That's where this thing happened and that thing happened. I lived next door to Mama San and Papa San, Mr. and Mrs. Hickerson. They were longtime Democratic Party supporters who had this immaculate lawn on the corner of 27th and Ellison. And they always told me about growing up in North Omaha, growing up in Omaha. Mrs. Hickerson had lived down by the river in the dirty 30s. And she told me stories of her family eating dandelion soup during the dirty 30s. So all of this kind of stuck in my brain, and you could see that it stuck so well that it pushed the hair out and made more room. And as it did that, I became entranced by trying to figure out what is North Omaha all about. My history teacher in high school, Mark Schultz, Mark didn't mention North Omaha's history because he didn't know it that well. And when I went to the Douglas County Historical Society, they didn't talk about North Omaha's history because, well, you know, they don't talk about North Omaha's history. You get the idea. It was missing. So then the internet happened. And somewhere along the way, I learned how to stick the crank in the side of the computer and churn it to make the mice meet, to make the internet go. And I used that to research the history of Omaha. From then, I ended up starting over 300 articles related to Omaha, Nebraska on Wikipedia. So kind of any time that you bump into something about Omaha on Wikipedia, I probably started it. And if I didn't, I might have gone in and messed it up. This is how my brain works. But I don't know about you, but reading encyclopedias isn't very exciting, right? So I decided to take and rewrite it and write what I wanted to on my own website. And that's where NorthOmahaHistory.com came from. I now have a social media following of 20,000 people every day. I've written 7 books, 3 of which are available free, including a history of Saratoga and a lot of others. I'll show those at the end. But now I want to jump into this particular presentation. I want to thank Mount Olive for hosting me. This is our 4th presentation, I believe, of the year. And it's been awesome. I mean, all of these presentations have been really fun for me to put together, and they challenge my brain. I'm trying to write about this differently than I do on the internet, so that this is unique content just for you. And I want to start right here on this very first slide, because you see 3 images right away. I want to give bonus points to anybody in the room. Can you identify any one of those 3 places that are pictured? Anybody? Go ahead.
I'm maybe the one on the right is the Reddick Mansion.
Ding, 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 ding. Gold star. That is called the Reddick Mansion, or was. It was at 24th and Pratt. It was built originally in the 1860s as a farmhouse. It was just a tiny little farmhouse. But at one point, a man named Clifton Maine bought it, and he restored it and renovated it and built it out and made it into this opulent Victorian era mansion in the 1870s. And then in the 1880s, Judge John A. Reddick, a lawyer in Omaha who became a judge, he bought it and loved it and raised kids there. One of his kids was Oakes Reddick, and Oakes sold it to the University of Omaha. It was a brand new institution in 1907 when it moved into its very first building. It lasted until 1917 when they sold it and took it apart, and it was shipped to Minnesota, where it was used as a dance hall for about a decade before it burnt down. So that's the Reddick Mansion. Bonus points for anybody else. I've got 2 more images up there. Can anybody guess either one of them? Please. Yeah.
Oh, okay. The one in the middle, I'm guessing, is a church, but I'm wondering if it's from the 60s riots.
So that's a great question, and not a terrible assumption. So this is Pilgrim Baptist Church, located at 24th and Hamilton. And the interesting part about this photo is that it shows Pilgrim Baptist Church after it's obviously burned out. However, this burning happened in 1951 under mysterious circumstances. Nobody knows why Pilgrim Baptist Church was burnt down. Of course, the minister was very activist and demanding for civil rights. And in 1951, there wasn't a big civil rights movement in Omaha. It was there, but it wasn't big. Anyway, church got burnt down. This photo is in its aftermath. If you go to Pilgrim Baptist today, you'll see the same or almost identical edifice still standing today. They rebuilt it identical to its original form. So that's the middle photo. Now on the far left, I'm going to give the credit to the person in the chat who said 24th and Sprague. I just featured this on the North Omaha Facebook page a couple weeks ago. This building was at the northwest corner of 24th and Sprague. It was phenomenal. I mean, look at the cool lintels on the top and the little features all around. It was built in 1888 as a drugstore and stayed that way all the way through the 1950s, then became a bar, and it was torn down right after the turn of the millennium. So bye-bye. But that said, this is the beginning of losing North Omaha's history. And you'll notice that I don't call it Lost North Omaha because it ain't done, and it's not done until we're forgotten. And even then, we're going to dig it back up. So today I'm going to run through 4 different things. I'm going to talk about losing people. I'm going to talk about losing places. I'm going to talk about losing events, and I'm going to talk about losing stories. At some point, I'm going to run out of time, and I'm going to regret not or trying to cover too much in too little time, but you're along for the ride. So let's see how this goes. The very first thing that I put up here photo-wise is Omaha's Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This little puppy stood over at Florence Boulevard, just off the boulevard on 21st Street, but it faced the boulevard. It had 5 acres around it, right at Miami Street. And yeah, believe it or not, this gigantic building that's shown here in the middle is built in 1904, and it stood all the way into the 1980s. It stopped being a seminary in 1947 when the Presbyterians decided that they had ministered all of the Midwest as much as they needed to, and they could shut this puppy down. I mean, tough luck to the Presbyterians, but and you can see the impact. I mean, how many Presbyterian churches can you name left in Omaha? At least, all right, the Florence Presbyterian, props. They stayed open, but there used to be 20 north of Dodge, 20 Presbyterian churches north of Dodge Street, and now we can name 3 total for the entire region. Anyway, let's not get into details. Let's just look at the pretty building. It's gone. Did anybody ever know this building to exist? Oh, after it was the seminary, eventually it became called the Landmark Apartments. And then the Mark IV Apartments. It had all these silly names, and then it was burnt down in a fire. Anybody ever know this to exist? Yeah, this is why I call it losing history. Please.
I did.
There it is.
I worked on them when they remodeled them back in probably the late 80s, early 90s.
Excellent. So that said, gone now. Let's check this out. Let's see what else we got going. The first part of this presentation is called Losing People. And I'm going to share the stories of 6 people. Interesting stories. And I'm not even going to share the story of this guy. The Omaha World Herald just published a story on him where they kind of took all my information from my website and just rewrote it. But let's not get caught up in the weeds. Again, this is Fritz Prees. Fritz Prees was this wild dude that lived north of Florence up in the Ponca Hills. The remnants of his dynasty are right at Oak Ridge Drive and River Drive, River Road. It's a little brick building. It's got 2 stories. You'll drive up the road to Dodge Park sometime and you'll see it. Anyway, Fritz Prees had a lake right there that was back in the hills. He had put a dam in, and for about 20 years between around 1890 to around 1910, it was a private park, and he rented it out with his own lake. And he had a 7-story house that was up in the hills. He was a weird Scandinavian. And when he died, there were a couple other things that were associated with him. Apparently, he had buried his wife in his brother's grave, and he had to exhume him, and it was a whole thing. And then in another incident, he had actually sent his brother off of a cliff to test out a flying machine that he invented in the 1890s, a little bit ahead of his time. Fritz Prees was a heck of a guy. Lost, generally. Now let's look at some others. This is York.
Kayla, do you want to watch this?
Oh, you mute yourself if you're at home.
Sorry, guys.
You're good. Okay, so York, enslaved by William Clark. York was a slave that was brought by William Clark, that came along with William Clark on the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was the first Black man in the Omaha area proper. There he is, right here. We know his name, we know his face, we know approximately when he was born, we know approximately when he died. And when was this ever taught in Omaha history in school? It's not. But we've got it here, and we're losing this history. In St. Louis, they put up a statue to York to acknowledge his role. In Portland, they tried putting one up, and on and on. So he went to the Pacific Ocean. He was the first African-American known to go to the Pacific Ocean from the east, or from St. Louis and back. He lived, and after the expedition, he asked William Clark for his freedom in exchange for what he had done. William Clark had denied it, and eventually York earned his freedom and paid off his ownership, and he went to live with the Crow people, and apparently was revered among the Crow and seen as an equal to the people in their tribe. This is York, the first Black man in Omaha. Now, not the only first Black man in Omaha, but the first. We'll get to that later. Here's an interesting dude. Has anybody here ever heard of James Monroe Parker?
Yes.
Excellent. We have a nerd in the room. No, I'm joking. Florence nerds are the best nerds because the history is so thick. You can see all my bullet points down the side. I'm not going to read them all verbatim, but the long story short is this. James Parker, old Jim Parker, he came to Omaha on behalf of a banking firm that was called Cook and Sargent. Cook and Sargent Parker ended up joining as a partner after he came to the Omaha area. But instead of going to Omaha to start his bank, he started one there, by the way. He also started one in the little town of Saratoga. And he started a third one in the little town of Florence called the Bank of Florence. You know it, you've seen it, 30th and Willett, go visit it. It's a real place. And if you haven't been in it, go quick, hurry. And tell the Florence Historical Society how much you love it and how much we appreciate that they keep it up and going. Lots of work has been done to save that building over the decades, starting in the 1960s. And we shouldn't let that go unseen itself. Saving history, saving history. Oh, it's a whole thing. But this James Monroe Parker, I think we've lost his story because we don't tell it in Omaha very much. The fact of the matter is, dude built a huge farm all across the Florence area, everywhere from Weber Street south down to Kansas Avenue, everywhere from about 33rd Street all the way over to the cliffs behind Florence Boulevard. The guy owned that big chunk of land. And you can visualize this. You could see this. You might even drive through it when we're done. The fact of the matter is, Parker assembled all that land, made it into a farm, grew corn across it. If you've heard the stories of the corn that was in Minnelusa before the neighborhood was developed, that was there because old man Parker put it in. He was a regular investor, though, and he had a couple things going. He bought $20,000 in stock for the Florence Bridge Company in 1857. Anybody get that? Florence Bridge, 1857. Yeah, he was a speculator. He was a dreamer with a lot of the guys and folks that were around Florence at that time, but they thought they were going to build a bridge on rock bottom there in the 1850s. It took 100 years for the first part of the Mormon Bridge to get built. So a little bit after Parker's time. Parker's son ended up who inherited Parker rebuilt his cabin again and again. It was at just west of 30th Street up Vane. And Parker rebuilt it again and again and expanded out the way that houses do. But his son ended up rebuilding it into a Moorish mansion. Huge flat walls, flat roof. It had a courtyard in the middle. The son's name was Fred Parker. He was called Fred Parker. And he ended up squandering his father's wealth, spent it all on opium and traveling the world. And he amassed a huge art collection, had one of the first art galleries in Omaha. At the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century. And yeah, his dad died in 1896 after he moved away from Florence in 1876. He ended up building a big old mansion over in Davenport, Iowa. That mansion's still there, but the Florence mansion was torn down in the 50s, 1950s, and there's no sign of it today. There's no sign of Parker. So that's Jim Parker. Here's an interesting character, and so very few people have heard of her. She's fun to look at, almost like a Muppet. She was called Granny Weatherford, Cornelia Granny Weatherford, born in 1831, lived until 1940. Wow. She was the patron saint of Squatters Row. Squatters Row was this area of shanties that was down around the North Yards for the railroads. The North Yards extended from about 11th Street to 13th Street, from Nicholas Avenue all the way up to Locust. So that big old region right there, but narrow. There were shanties all along the sides of it. And Granny Weatherford had built her shanty in Omaha in 1870. And she insisted on the right to remain on her shanty because she'd lived there for 8 years without being kicked out by the landowner, who were the railroads. She actually made the argument for a lot of other squatters who were in that same area. She was one of the last residents of Squatters Row, though. Then they ended up kicking her out in 1938. So at the age of 107, they kicked her out of Squatters Row. She ended up dying at 109, and she's buried at Forest Lawn. You can go check out her grave right now. Check out the headlines that they had in the World Herald. Old lady smokes cigars. Aged woman enjoys a stogie. She said she smoked since the age of 8, and she drank since, quote, I could reach the table. Right? You get the sense. She was a heck of a character. But again, completely lost. We don't have these stories anywhere in our history. I'm not sure where she'd fit in, but she's fun to talk about. This guy isn't so fun to talk about as he is for me to admire. I mean, heck of a guy. Edwin Overall, born in 1835 into slavery. He was enslaved in Missouri, which of course was a slaveholding state. It was part of the South. And before Omaha, he had actually received his freedom. He was a free man. And he went to Chicago, where he was an Underground Railroad conductor. And he recruited for the U.S. Army during the Civil War. So imagine that, escaping enslavement and then becoming a conductor and then recruiting for the Civil War. I mean, he was dedicated for sure. 1869, he moves to Omaha. So he's already in his 30s and had a career going in Chicago. He moves to Omaha. He invests. He actually owned a mine, a coal mine down by Plattsmouth. That coal mine became a famous swimming beach later because he didn't find a lot of coal there. But in 1870, he became the first Black mail carrier in Omaha and the first Black federal employee in Omaha. Federal employment was a really big deal in Omaha for about 50 years. If you were hired by the U.S. government, you were in not only a position of stability, but in the Black community, you were automatically a leader in the community and overall used that position and did a lot of things. 1872, he won a campaign to desegregate Omaha schools. That's right. Starting in 1865, Omaha had a, quote, colored school that was segregated from the other public school for white kids. So from 1865 to 1872, that segregation continued. Overall, ended up bringing groups of African Americans to the school board meetings and testifying and sharing reasons why that segregation didn't need to happen, and he won. 1876, he co-led the first Nebraska Convention of Colored Men. 1879, his daughter, Ida Overall, became the first Black woman to graduate from Omaha High School, which we know today is Central High. That's right. She graduated there. 1880, he co-led the Nebraska State Convention of Colored Americans. They were bringing in women and really building out their platforms, as it were. 1890, he became the first African-American candidate for the Nebraska State Legislature. And he lost. But in 1892, the first one won, so he primed the pump, as it were. 1893, he became the first African-American to run for the city commission, which is today's city council. He lost, and it took a very long time for Fred Conley to end up joining the city council. 1896, though, he proposed the National Congress of Afro-Americans at the Trans-Mississippi Expo, right at the beginning of the planning for that. He didn't get that to happen. However, he did get the Congress of White and Colored Americans to happen. It was a day-long event in August of 1898, so towards the end of the Trans-Mississippi Expo. You know the pictures, the ones down at Coons Park, the big, gigantic, it was called the White City, because all the buildings were plaster white and they were spectacular to look at. And the first large installation of electric lights in Omaha was there at the TME. Well, he held a Congress of White and Colored Americans there. In 1898, when was the last time you heard of that history in Omaha? Integration in Omaha in 1898? Well, anyway, heck of a guy, losing our history. Comfort Baker, 1870. I'll just jump to the chase with this. 1898, she was the first African-American female graduate of Omaha Public Schools. Now, wait, we just heard that about Ida Overall. Well, you know, this is part of the sticky thing about history. 1879 for Ida, 1889 for Comfort. Something happened somewhere where some records were lost. But the long story short is, Comfort Baker was really important in the city's history, in Omaha's history. But she became more important after she left Omaha. See, she was orphaned in 1883. She didn't have any family supports here. And she became a teacher. And in Omaha Public Schools, if you became a teacher in the 1890s, you were not allowed to teach in Omaha. It just didn't happen. So she moved away. Originally, she moved to Texas, and she taught at a Black school in Texas. Eventually, she got to Phoenix. In 1918, she was the first African-American teacher in the Phoenix Union High School District in Phoenix, Arizona. In 1918, she founded the only school for Black students in Phoenix. They wanted to segregate their schools, and she got it going. 1925, she became the first African-American principal for the Phoenix Union High School District when the schools integrated. 1940, she retired. She died, and she was buried in Phoenix. But this magnificent woman with all this history, we've lost it. We've also lost this man's history, which is a shame. Guys, check this out. Dr. Aaron Manassas McMillan was the third African-American to serve in the Nebraska State Legislature. So this is Ernie's predecessor by several decades. He left Omaha, though, and he left the legislature early to become a missionary doctor in Angola. There was an organization of missionaries who brought they were African-American missionaries who went to Africa to mission in Africa in lots of different ways. This was Dr. McMillan was the first African-American doctor to go from the United States to Angola. He had to stop over in Portugal along the way because Angola was still a Portuguese colony. And he had to stop in Angola. I'm sorry, he had to stop in Portugal to earn a medical degree there in order to be a doctor in Angola. But he got there and he built a medical legacy in Angola that's still acknowledged today. It's an incredible story that actually has its own strand. And I'm not even going to go down that line, but let me say, I was just contacted in the last 2 months by people in Angola who were trying to research Dr. McMillan. They found my article about him and they loved it because it told the rest of the story that they didn't know. But check out the rest of the story. He came back to Omaha in 1948. So the dude was there for a really long time, almost 20 years. During World War II. He came back to Omaha after doing all of this missionary work in Angola. He comes back to Omaha and starts a free hospital at 20th and Grace, because he knew that not only blacks needed medical assistance, but low-income whites did too. Oh, by the way, black people weren't routinely permitted to get healthcare inside of Omaha's hospitals before the 1960s. It just didn't happen. It wasn't okay. So Dr. McMillan started a free hospital. It lasted only for 5 years, not because it wasn't needed, not because he couldn't get funding for it, but because the city of Omaha found it violated code that couldn't be fixed. Now, there's probably some machinations underneath all of this that I can't find, but I've looked for. But what I know is that 1953, that hospital gets closed. 1954, Dr. McMillan built a brand new building at the same location to run his own medical clinic out of for the next 20 years. So, not sure what happened there. But regardless, 1959, he becomes the first black man appointed to the Omaha Housing Authority, which was started in the late 1930s. 1971, he moves out to California after he had some heart problems, and he ended up dying there. Nowhere in Omaha is Dr. McMillan recognized anymore. There's no street named after him, no buildings, nothing. So that's losing people. York, James Park, Granny Weatherford, Edwin Overall. I put Red Perkins in here. I took him out, but I put in Comfort Baker, Dr. McMillan. You all know who is missing from my list. And honestly, if this presentation was all about losing people, I could have 40 people here and it would barely skim the surface of who's been lost. But right now in your own brains, you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, he needs to talk about, he needs to mention, he should know about, and I want to know. So hold your thought, take a note if you need to, type it in your phone, write it down on a piece of paper. We're going to come around to that at the end. This picture right here shows the Bedford Place Neighborhood Association at a 1981 picnic that they had. Losing people. Oh, wait, they had a neighborhood association there? OMG. Losing places is the second part of this. And unfortunately, I made a mistake when I made this section of the presentation. First thing, I want to show you this absolutely gorgeous building, Romanesque revival style, with some Byzantine style flourishes on it. It almost looks like a church on the front side. Anybody know this picture? Does anybody know this place?
Greenhouse.
Say that again.
The greenhouse.
Oh, the greenhouse. You do know. How do you know?
Glass ceiling.
Okay, so it's a greenhouse with glass ceilings. Okay, we're smart. Anybody know where it was? Okay, so check this out. This greenhouse was built at Forest Lawn Cemetery at 40th and Forest Lawn Avenue in 1907. It sat on the north side of Forest Lawn Avenue. So when you went in through the old entrance, it was on the north side. It sat there all the way into the 1950s. And then in the early 60s, it was demolished because it was out of date. Now, we could talk about Forest Lawn and the way that it demolishes buildings, but let's not get hung up on that, except to say that caretaker's house didn't have to die. That was right across the road from this building. So here's how I messed up. You see the list of topics underneath losing places: lost towns, lost cemeteries, hidden developments, forgotten schemes, demolished buildings. Great topics, Adam. Wonderful. However, apparently I focused on lost towns too much, and we already did that presentation in this series. So I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm going to repeat some content that you might have heard if you've been to that, if you came to that presentation. If you didn't, this is going to be cool because lost towns are super fun. But then as I got to the end of the lost towns section, I realized I'm out of time and I didn't cover the other stuff. So let me say this really quick about lost cemeteries. My area of analysis of inclusion for all of North Omaha's history is north of 72nd Street, north of Dodge Street, east of 72nd. North of Dodge, all the way up to the Washington County line, east of 72nd, all the way to the river. In that area, in that region of the city, there are no fewer than 12 cemeteries. 12 cemeteries, Adam, that's ridiculous. Y'all, if I started listing them, it would kind of blow your mind. You already got the big ones. I mean, we mentioned Forest Lawn. You know about Prospect Hill, the city's pioneer cemetery. You probably know about Temple Israel Cemetery, which actually has 3 separate cemeteries in it. You might know about the Shipley Cemetery up in Ponca Hills. Of course, you know about the Mormon Pioneer Cemetery, but did you know about the Cutler's Park Cemetery? Yeah, that's out of Young Street and Mormon Bridge Road. And then no fewer than 7 others dot North Omaha. They're all on my website. Look up lost cemeteries in North Omaha. You'll come across them. Hidden developments. There were so many developments that happened in North Omaha. Neighborhood developments, you know, like they do out in West Omaha. Yeah, we had those all across North Omaha from the day the city was platted. And they're hidden now because they've been absorbed, and the media and politicians love to call North Omaha, North Omaha. They don't call it the Koontz Place neighborhood. They don't call it the Florence neighborhood oftentimes, but they certainly don't refer to the High Point neighborhood. They don't refer to the Central Park neighborhood in North Omaha. They don't talk about on and on and on. We have more than 50 historic neighborhoods north of Dodge Street, east of 72nd. I'm trying to pull them all out. You check out my blog, you're going to find a lot. But the other thing that we have in North Omaha are other forgotten developments, places that were started that never reached a neighborhood status. They never reached a town, but they still existed and they're cool. Edgewood Park, I'll get to that in a minute. But here's some missing towns. Here's some lost towns in North Omaha. Saratoga, established in 1856. It formally folded just a year later. That banking scare that wiped out the Florence Bank, it also wiped out the Saratoga Bank and the town of Saratoga. But in 1860, the town still existed. There was a school there, businesses, homes, the Omaha Driving Park. It was all right there in Saratoga. It was annexed into Omaha in 1877, and nobody's referred to it since. Oh yeah, we had Saratoga School all the way until 2021 when OPS closed it formally. Now it's a special school that meets special needs of the students, and it has a different name. But before that, there were 4 different Saratoga schools built between 1860 and 2021. East Omaha. Now, come on, Adam. East Omaha is no big deal. It's still there, right? Absolutely not. No way, shape, and form. Okay, there's one house. Let me tell you why. Because when I was growing up in North Omaha, and still what I know about North Omaha, when we say East Omaha, we're talking about everything down there, right? Everything from the cliffs behind Florence Boulevard all the way over to the airport, somewhere around there. But check this out. East Omaha was originally a town that was started on Locust Street, east of Abbott Drive. Wrap your head around where that is. The Open Door Mission, you got it. The East Omaha Railroad Bridge, you got it. Guys, it was amazing down there. There were 2,500 houses in East Omaha as recently as the 1940s. It was never incorporated as a town. It was scruffy, scraggedy. There were truck farms down there. There were all kinds of places that bars and grocery stores that the rest of Omaha never went to. But it was still a real place that people really did live in. It counted. 1877, the Cutoff Lake was created. That little area that was populated inside of Cutoff Lake. You know, we call it the city of Carter Lake today. Yeah, that was originally called East Omaha. 1884, the East Omaha Land Company was created. In 1890, the largest land deal in Nebraska history up until that point happened in East Omaha by the Omaha Bridge and Terminal Railway Company. They decided that they were going to make $1 billion off of East Omaha. And so they bought all the land inside of Cutoff Lake. They turned it into parks. They had an amusement park called Cortland Beach in 1892. It was owned by a man named John Creighton, who started a college. Same guy, same place. East Omaha's continued to exist. 1891, they put a streetcar in. It was a company town. They started the East Omaha industrial area. It had 7 different factories that were down there. The last one just closed out in 2020. It was called the East Omaha Box Company. It still exists today out in Millard. But this little thing kept happening. You could see a bunch of annexations listed here at the bottom, 1854, 1926, 1956. Yeah, this other thing kept happening. Floods. Apparently flooding was an issue, but let's get to that in a minute. Other lost towns, DeBolt and Benson. DeBolt, way out there at 60th and Reed. You can go visit there today. You can see a map of it right here. Girard is the only street that still has the same name. You see the timeline. 1872, Springville School was started out there. 1882, a Scandinavian colony was established out there. 1887, development was established. A development called DeBolt Place was established by real estate sellers. 1888, DeBolt Station, a railroad. There were 2 railroads that converged at DeBolt, and they needed a station there to load cattle onto and all of the produce from the farms nearby. And 1889, Springwell Danish Cemetery was established. It was all annexed into Omaha in the 1890s. And so if you love or have any interest in that region, there's DeBolt. Benson, we all know Benson. We all love Benson. And if you don't love Benson, go check it out. It's fun to walk around. Erastus himself lived from 54 to 1932. He platted the town of Benson in 1887. He named it after himself. He's a humble guy. Oh, he also named it after his co-investor, a guy named Clifton Maine. Remember his name? He owned Reddick Mansion. Yeah, Clifton Maine, his last name was spelled Mayne. They were a pair of funny guys, though, Erastus Benson and Clifton Maine, because they decided to name the street that went through downtown Benson after Mr. Maine, and they called it Mayne Street. Yeah, funny guys. Anyway, Krug Park. If you don't know about Krug Park, you should look it up. Fascinating place. It was the center of Omaha's hot life. If you were involved in the romance of Peony Park in the 60s and 70s or 50s, Krug Park was Peony Park before that. Right? It was that kind of place. It was hopping. Everything was happening there. It was the whole Benson was annexed into Omaha in 1917, same year as Florence. Krug Park, there was a disaster in 1930 where a roller coaster accident. Several people were killed. A bad scene. And the park closed in 1940. The only thing that's left of it today is Gallagher Park in its place. Then there's this little city. You know, we all know Florence exists and we love it. But the rest of Omaha is kind of forgotten, or they tend to. You know how they are. But Briggs, you might not know about. Probably. How about a show of hands? Do you know about Briggs? I see one. Cool. All right, let's remember Briggs. Let's bring back Briggs. Clinton Briggs was the mayor of Omaha. One of the first ones. He was in the first 10. I don't remember which number. But they named this little development after him over North 53rd to 64th at Garvin Street, including McKinley and kind of that whole little region. If you look on a map, you'll see a little rectangle, and that belonged to Briggs. Briggs was, again, never formally established as a town, but it had a post office starting in 1892. There was a railroad station built there in 1877 by the Omaha Road that went through there. That was what the railroad was called. St. John's Lutheran Church was a German church. It was founded in 1902, and its beautiful little building still stands there today. You can go see the evidence yourself. The post office closed in 1913, and Briggs Station was abandoned in 1920. But I'm here to tell you, you can go see Briggs Station today. It was made into a house. It still sits in that region. If you want to know the address, send me an email and I'll chip it over to you. I don't want to, share it out publicly. That'd be tacky. But it still stands, and it looks like a little old train station that's been made into a house. Kind of fun. Florence itself, you guys know the history of Florence. I don't need to belabor it here. But winter quarters, let's remember, I'm sorry, this is a typo. Winter quarters was established in 1846. 1856, the city of Florence was chartered. 1917, Omaha annexed Florence. I'm embarrassed by that typo, so I'm going to flip past this slide. Losing places. So we've talked about some of these lost towns. Here's a lost development, Edgewood Park. What, Adam, what is this Edgewood Park that you mentioned? Well, check this out. Edgewood Park in the 1910s was owned by African Americans. They advertised it as having a view of Carter Lake and that anybody could experience home ownership down in the area. Guys, this is at North 9th Street, extending from Fort all the way up to Hartman, extending all the way over to Abbott Drive. And if you know what I know, it's kind of challenging to envision African Americans living in that neighborhood. But there was a time when Black people lived there because Edgewood Park sold a few houses, not a lot, and it ended up disappearing into time. It's lost. Lost cemeteries, we talked about those. Hidden developments, we talked about those. Forgotten schemes, oh my gosh. I don't even know where to start. And I think that next year I'm going to do a presentation on demolished buildings because there's just so much to cover. We have lost so many buildings in North Omaha, from Florence all the way down to Dodge Street, from the river all the way over to 72nd. So many buildings gone. And we've got to remember these places. We've got to find them back. But we need to get into this next part of losing North Omaha, because these lost events, they'll break your heart if you know about them. The first industry in North Omaha. Well, first, look at that. The Carter Lake Dance Hall. Ooh, ooh. Anybody here ever go to Carter Lake for a concert or event in the 1970s? 60s? Nothing? All right, cool. We don't hang around at Carter Lake. That's good. Well, this building was actually built in 1918. And it stood all the way until the 1940s when it was rebuilt. And that building stood into the 1980s, early 1980s. Was eventually called the Carter Lake Ballroom. The events that we've lost the first industry in North Omaha. That's right. The first industry in North Omaha was fur trading. Oh yeah, pet that fine beaver silk hat that you have on, or wrap that mink stole around your neck. Maybe when you get home, you'll cover up with your fox fur blanket. I don't know. You get the idea. The whole fur trading industry was, it was the rage. And it's hard for us to really grok that today, thinking about how gross it is to wrap a fur around you and wear that animal that's beautiful and does cool things on Instagram or wherever you watch your videos. If you watch them, it's hard to wrap around how important that industry was, but it really was part of what settled the West at all. And North Omaha was key in the entire industry in America. Not just in Nebraska, not just in Omaha, but all across the entire country. North Omaha was important for the fur industry. 1812, Fort Lisa was established by Manuel Lisa. Manuel Lisa was a Spanish trader who worked for the American Fur Trading Company, and building this fort on the Missouri River up by Ponca Creek was a stake that they put down in the ground to say, hey, this place matters to us. They invited the Pawnee, the Sioux, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Cheyenne, the Mandan, the Crow, the Ankara, and other tribes to bring their furs down there. It's hard to envision this right now, but picture the Missouri River as we know it, being about a mile wide the whole way, about a foot deep, more like the Platte River, but being packed with canoes, keel boats, and all kinds of different haulers coming down that river that were packed with hundreds of pelts. And that's what it looked like coming up to Fort Lisa. Fort Lisa had a stockade wall. Now, the picture in the upper right-hand corner, that's actually called Fort Lisa, but that's up in North Dakota. This is in Omaha's Fort Lisa. I can't find an image of Omaha's Fort Lisa, and I've been looking for 15 years. So if anybody's got one hidden, you let me know. But this is approximately what it looked like, because it did have a stockade wall. It had houses all the way around its walls by report. There were farms there. There were enslaved people who lived there. And Manuel Lisa himself lived there. In 1812, a man named Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable moved there. He lived there for 2 years approximately. Yeah, Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, he started a little city up on a river, on a big lake that eventually became Chicago. So this dude is pretty important. Oh, and by the way, African-American or black man, who was French and did this fur trading work and lived in North Omaha. Go figure. So Manuel Lisa left and died in 1820, went back to St. Louis and he's buried there. Cabinet's trading post moved in approximately the same year that Manuel Lisa died. At least they got it going and then they built it out. Now, this picture in the bottom left-hand corner of the two, this was actually commissioned in the 1970s or 80s. So it's a modern drawing and a speculation of what it looked like. But you can imagine, oh, that creek right there. Anybody know the creeks of North Omaha? Well, anyway, it's not Mill Creek. This was supposed to be Ponca Creek. And Cabinet's post was supposed to be right on Ponca's Creek. What we know today, however, because of archaeology, is that Cabinet's trading post was actually right next to the present day River Road, J.J. Pershing Drive, before you get to the Hummel Park entrance, before you get to Oak Ridge Drive, or between Oak Ridge Drive and the Hummel Park entrance. Off on the right-hand side, on the east side of River Road, that's where the fort stood, because the river came all the way over to that point. And again, imagine all these canoes piling up and just coming in. 1833, Cabinet served an important role because he welcomed Prince Maximilian of Neuwied, I don't know, say German. A painter named Karl Bodmer was with him. You could see Bodmer's works over at the Joslin Art Museum right now. One of the works that he painted was of Cabinet's post. And it's a beautiful painting. You can see it in my article on NorthOmahaHistory.com. The post merged with Fontenelle's post in 1833. Almost completely forgotten. And if you know about these places, if you remember, there's a little marker at the front of Hummel Park that mentions both of these. The problem is nobody's taught about this. Young people don't know about it if they don't read that marker on that corner at that time. We're losing this history. We're losing the history of the Greater American Expo. You know, not all history is fun and games. Some of it's just kind of gross and disgusting. Maybe we want to forget it. But in 1898, a man named Ed Rosewater, Ed had a little newspaper in Omaha called the Omaha Bee. Ed was he's remembered today for being a yellow journalist. He liked to sensationalize the news in order to sell more papers. I don't know if that sounds like any news today, but all the same, he bought the Trans-Mississippi Expo grounds after they were over. Everybody remembers Trans-Mississippi, 1898, beautiful white buildings, blah, blah, blah. Well, there were 50 buildings left a year later, about 9 months later. Buildings left. Some of the buildings were demolished. There were 100 for the Trans-Mississippi Expo, so only 50 left 6 months later. Ed Rosewater bought him, said, we're going to do a bigger expo. At that time, the Spanish-American War was happening. The United States was absorbing all these colonies around the world. The empire was expanding. And you could see right here in the graphic in the upper corner, there's Uncle Sam pointing to the Philippines with the phrase, the white man's burden underneath. So yeah, maybe we want to forget this, Adam. Maybe this is kind of gross, but we have to remember even the gross part sometimes, right? Lest we repeat our mistakes. The expo opened in 1899 in July, but it closed in October 31st of 1899. It was a bankruptcy. It crashed. It did terrible. Only 845,000 people went, and half of those were on free passes. By comparison, the Trans-Mississippi Expo had 2.5 million. So didn't really work. And isn't really talked about ever anymore. Even at the Durham Museum that we know and love for their beautiful TME Expo, they don't even mention the Greater American Expo. And then this is one that we should remember. Again, not because it was wonderful, but quite the opposite. This man is called Larkin McLeod. He was born Charles Smith in Mississippi in 1887. In 1917, he was framed for murdering Nellie Nethaway. Now, this is an important story that we need to remember for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being, you could see 1917, he was traveling with a circus, and he left the circus in Omaha that year. That weekend after he left, he walked from downtown Omaha, where the train was, up to Florence. He got to Florence, and he was accused of murdering Nellie Nethaway. Nellie lived with her husband, Claude Nethaway. Has anybody here ever heard of Claude Nethaway? All right, no hands. So Claude Nethaway was a real estate agent in Florence who before 1917 advertised openly on his business cards that he loved to sell Florence real estate, and that was his specialty, but he would not sell it to Black people, people of Asian descent, or other people that he didn't want to. And he didn't use those terms to refer to the people. He was openly, virulently racist. He believed that white supremacy was the only way to run the land. And when his wife died, he saw a transient man walking along the railroad tracks and said, "It was him. He did it." Larkin kept walking up the railroad tracks. He was just moving on. He got to Blair, where he was met by a mob that was going to lynch him. The police arrested him right away, threw him into jail to keep him safe. The Omaha police came up to Blair in 1917, and they took Larkin McLeod from this jail, and they brought him back to the Omaha jail. 2 years later, a mob would show up at that same jail and take another prisoner. And this mob was outside of the Omaha jail trying to take him. The Omaha jail was located in the Douglas County Courthouse. You can go visit the courthouse right now. But in 1918, Larkin McLeod was convicted of murdering Nellie Nethaway. After 3 trials, in 2 of the trials, he was found innocent. The 3rd trial, none of the evidence changed. None of the testimony changed for the prosecution. Larkin McLeod had new testimony from different people to say he was nowhere near the incident when it happened, and they saw who did it. It was reported openly in the World Herald and the Omaha Bee and the other sources. And who did it according to these witnesses? Claude Nethaway. Larkin McLeod was framed for the murder of Nethaway's wife. Oh, by the way, Nethaway's brother had killed his wife just 2 years earlier. And then the next year, Nethaway went down, led a mob to the Omaha courthouse, and, well, they actually did lynch Will Brown, but that's another story. We haven't forgotten that one. We did, until I started talking about it about a decade ago. Now there's a new monument, a new marker down at the Douglas County Courthouse for the lynching of Will Brown. There's a marker there for the lynching of a man named George Smith in 1891. But nobody remembers Larkin McLeod, who's buried at the state pen today and forgotten. And then the end of East Omaha. This is too long. This is ridiculously long, and we're running low on time. But I want to tell you this. 1943. So we talked about the establishment of the town of East Omaha. This is actually an aerial picture of East Omaha in 1943. You can see why they had to move. But they didn't want to. These were people who lived in a neighborhood. There were no dikes along the Missouri River. That beautiful dike that we know today, it was originally built in the 1920s, but it didn't go as far south as East Omaha. There was little airplanes flying in and out of the Omaha Municipal Airport all the way up to 1960. It was a tiny little joint. And then a guy named Gene Epley donated a lot of money. And they laid down some jet runways, and they renamed the airport for him. And today Epley Airfield's doing well. It's got a bit of room down there. But they moved the town in order to expand it as much as they needed to. Oh, wait a second. The town that they moved? It was located where the runways are now, but it was also located along Locust Avenue, like I talked earlier. It was located where the Open Door Mission is. It was located where several industries continue to exist today. Oh, yeah, the corrections facility and the juvenile jail. Yeah, it was located there, too. You could still go and see the places where there was a bar. The building still stands. There was a grocery store. The building still stands. There was, out of all of these houses, 2,500 houses in East Omaha, there's one left today. One out of 2,500. You can go see it. But you can also see this right here in my history. 1943, huge flood. 1952, even bigger flood. In that flood, the people, the residents of this town, they were moved up to Miller Park to temporary housing. In 1952, if anybody remembers tents in Miller Park, that's what they were. 1967, major flooding. 1984, major flooding. 1990, major flooding. 2020, major flooding. Right? So the area is a little bit water prone. And you can see, now we can see why that neighborhood was taken out by the city. But then it was all speculation. It was all speculation. There was a church there, the East Omaha Presbyterian Church. There were grocery stores, I've said grocery stores and bars and all of this. The East Omaha Railroad Bridge was closed in 1880 and it hasn't been opened since. It still stands, but surely that thing isn't long for the world. They keep it open as the emergency second bridge to Omaha in case something happens to the UP bridge. Supposedly, they keep it standing for that reason. Open Door moved down there in 1986. Go drive around it sometime. It's fascinating. Lost history. And then here's the last item of lost history that I want to talk about because it's near and dear to our hearts. 1973, a man named Ness Latenser proposed having the Florence Historical Village. It was going to include several places. The Florence Mill that we know and love, hopefully, run by Linda Miggs today. If you don't go to the farmer's market in the summer, you need to. The Florence Depot, go tour that railroad museum today. It's waiting for you. These places have to get people to come to them, to let them know we're not losing this history. We're trying not to anyway. The Florence Waterworks, the Florence Waterworks Superintendent's Mansion. Now, if you remember the waterworks and how spectacular it was in the 1950s, if you know the story of its demolition, we also know that part of the Minnelusa pumping station still stands today. They actually restored it with some beauty in the 2010s, and you can go check it out now. It's actually worth looking at. You can see the original frames of the original windows. They've done a lot of work to make it look good, but the original is long gone. It had a 5-story tower on it. It was so beautiful. They used to bring people from Omaha all the way up to Florence to go to balls, to attend fancy balls with orchestras and quartets and stuff. There was a superintendent's mansion at the waterworks, and this is a picture of it right here. They were trying to save it in 73, and Latenser thought of the whole project of having a historical village like Colonial Williamsburg, a historical reenactment. Imagine that. Along the main street in Florence, I'm sorry, North 30th. Silly me. He wanted to include the Florence Town Square. You know it, the Florence Park with the gazebo. Yeah, that's the town square going back to the winter quarters in 1846 from their original maps. It's right there in Florence. Same with the Mormon cemetery. You know that you can visit it all the time, but it has this bigger connection, this bigger role. The Florence building that's now the Universal College of Health or something.
Healing
Yeah.
Arts.
Thank you. 1922. The Florence Masonic Temple that's now apartments. McClure's Cash Store still stands. The Price Building still stands. There's so much history right in Florence, and there's been movements to save it. But we're losing it. We're losing that memory. Oh yeah, here's a little picture. I love this one. This is over at 40th and Lake. It was an 1886 structure. It still stands at 40th and Lake. It was a train depot for the Beltline around North Omaha. Oh, wait, that's been lost. But you can go look at the building. The last thing that we're losing are your stories, pioneer stories, institutional histories, forced assimilations, the hidden past of North Omaha. All of these things are disappearing. And guys, I wouldn't know if I didn't go digging for it in the first place. Nobody's written these books before. And I feel like I'm compelled to write this all because nobody shared it. Again, the Historical Society doesn't cover it. And as far as I know, they're not interested. The Durham Museum is trying to bring in a new focus around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to congratulate them for doing that work. But are they really doing it right now? The Great Plains Black History Museum captured so much of this history for a long time, but today focuses on national Black history, which is important. But we have to remember this local history, regardless, or when, in addition to African Americans, we need to contextualize that history in with all of North Omaha. There are so many industries, there's so many churches, there's so many parks, there's so many houses, there's so many buildings, so many people that are all gone now. So I've created these resources to try to capture some of it. NorthOmahaHistory.com, guys, I have 600 articles there all about North Omaha's history, the people, places, events that make North Omaha go around. It's free, it's online, it's waiting for you right now. Facebook.com/North Omaha History. I share this stuff every single day. Instagram, I do the same thing. I published 4 books that are available on Amazon. North Omaha History Volumes 1, 2, and 3. There are different collections of topics. Omaha Black History, African American people, places, and events from the history of Omaha, Nebraska. Then I have free books that are online right now. A picture history of Omaha's Saratoga neighborhood. I mentioned that earlier. It's free online, and it reads like one of those cool little history books, you know, with all the pictures and they're just little blurbs. I did that for you for free. I might do it for Florence if I can get some love on that idea. Or the Middaloosa neighborhood, that'd be cool. Middaloosa, Miller Park, Florence Field. I can mix them all together. Anyway, North Omaha History Timeline. It's free. It's 140 pages long. It's ridiculous. This guy's a nerd. The Guide to Fort Omaha. I made a free PDF showing the current buildings and the historical pictures and telling you what they used to be and what they are now. And then chapter 103 out of one of my volumes is the history of Tech High. I also have a podcast that comes out once a month. We put out podcast episodes. I've got about 90 of them recorded now. They're all free and waiting for you. If you have any information, details, stuff I need to know, send me a line, info@NorthOmahaHistory.com. My name's Adam, and that's Losing the History of North Omaha. It's 12, or it's on the dot right now. It's the hour. Does anybody have any quick questions that they want to throw out there? I'm available, but if you need to run, you should. Does anybody have any questions? Make sure to speak towards the mic.
Doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like there's any questions, Adam.
Yay! I answered all the questions. Guys, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I love that you came for this. Thanks again to Mount Olive.
I do have one question.
Fire away.
Tell me about the Omaha Driving Park.
So just as a note, everybody Google Omaha Driving Park history and look at my NorthOmahaHistory.com article for pictures and a lot more information than what I can say in 1 minute. But long story short, the Omaha Driving Park was founded in the 1860s when they drove little two-wheeled wagons. They have a name. I'm not remembering what they are. The little two-wheeled wagons. Say that again.
Stirring.
There you go. So they whipped those around an oval track. In time, they built a grandstands to watch the races. In time, they built a grandstands, and then they built gigantic barns. And then they built, and it turned out to be an entire institution with between 12 and 20 buildings at any time that stood from the 1860s all the way into the 1900s. And by 1910, they had shut it down, and then they reopened it as a car driving park. So it took 50 years for it to have cars on it. Those raced around for about 7 or 8 years before they took that out. They moved it down to Carter Lake, and they developed the neighborhood. Today, that neighborhood is located west of Commercial Avenue, north of Laird. West of Commercial Avenue, north of Laird, east of Florence Boulevard. It's tucked away in that weird corner right there in the Saratoga neighborhood. And that was the Omaha Driving Park. It was part of the Trans-Mississippi Expo. It's the first place where Wild Bill Hickok's Wild West show was performed professionally. They didn't volunteer to do it. They came to Omaha and made people pay. And they did it right there in North Omaha at 24th and Ames, southeast of 24th and Ames, down to 16th and Laird, Commercial Avenue, yada, 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 yada. That's a little bit about Omaha Driving Park. Anybody else? Cool. Thanks, guys. Send me a note. Tell me what I need to know. I'd love to hear from you.